The day Harry Truman realized the Soviets wanted half of Europe didn't happen in a grand moment inside the Oval Office. It didn't arrive on a battlefield, and it didn't come from a dramatic announcement. It crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching across a map. And it began long before Truman even became president. It began in February 1945, inside a room at Yalta, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin carved up the world, while Truman was still in the dark, still a vice president nobody told anything to. When Roosevelt died in April 1945, Truman walked into the presidency knowing almost nothing about the war's deepest secrets. Within hours of taking office, he was handed information about America's creation of an unimaginable new weapon, briefed on military plans he had never seen before, and told about agreements that had already been signed with the Soviets without him. But out of everything he absorbed in those first days, nothing shocked him more than the growing sense that Stalin viewed Europe not as a continent to rebuild, but as a trophy. Truman had admired the Soviets as tough fighters. During the worst days of the conflict, when the German advance was pushing deep into the east, when cities were burning and resistance seemed hopeless, they held the line. America respected that. But now the war in Europe was ending, and Truman expected cooperation. What he discovered instead was that Stalin had a very different vision. A Europe split, controlled, and reshaped to Soviet interests. The first clues came through cables from American diplomats stationed in Eastern Europe. Truman began reading reports about Soviet behavior in Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, countries that were supposed to choose their own governments after the war. Instead, Soviet security forces were rounding up opposition leaders, intimidating political rivals, and squeezing local governments into replacing independent ministers with communist ones. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't temporary, and it wasn't the liberation America expected. Truman found out that Roosevelt had trusted Stalin's promises at Yalta, that elections would be free and governments would reflect the will of the people. Now Truman saw the results. The so-called elections were being controlled by Soviet-backed parties. Voters were pressured. Opponents vanished. Even the boundaries on the map were shifting without negotiation. Stalin acted first and talked later. At first, Truman didn't want to jump to conclusions. The world was still in chaos. Supply lines were exhausted. Millions were displaced. Perhaps the Soviets were trying to stabilize the region. But then came the reports that changed everything. American envoys wrote that the Soviets weren't behaving like temporary guardians. They were acting like owners. Every factory seized, every police force replaced, every newspaper controlled, every election manipulated. It painted one clear picture. This wasn't reconstruction, it was takeover. The moment everything crystallized for Truman came in late spring of 1945, when he met Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. Truman confronted him directly about the broken promises in Poland. The exchange was so heated, Molotov complained he had never been talked to that way before. Truman didn't back down. He told Molotov that if the Soviets wanted cooperation, they had to honor their agreements. Molotov left furious, but Truman wasn't shaken. He just realized something far more important. Diplomacy alone wouldn't stop Stalin. The Soviets had already made up their minds. From that moment on, Truman completely shifted his view of post-war Europe. Instead of preparing for friendly cooperation, he began preparing for a rival. But the most unsettling part was that even America's top generals were coming to the same conclusion. Reports from military intelligence showed that the Soviets were keeping huge numbers of troops in Eastern Europe long after the conflict ended. Instead of demobilizing, they were reinforcing. And instead of working with Western allies to rebuild, they were sealing off borders, moving factories to the east, and tightening control. American observers noticed something else too. The Soviets were studying the power vacuum left behind by the defeated German Reich. They were stepping into it, region by region. In Germany, they dismantled entire industries and shipped them east. In Czechoslovakia, they pressured local leaders until elections swung in their favor. In the Balkans, they placed loyal administrations in charge. The Soviets were not waiting for a conference, or a treaty, or permission. They were building a sphere of influence, one that stretched from the Baltic to the Balkans. Truman didn't want a confrontation. America was tired. Millions of troops needed to come home. The country wanted peace. But Truman also understood what happened the last time Europe was left unstable. A vacuum invited extremism, and the only thing worse than one rising empire was two. As more reports arrived, it became clear the Soviets had no intention of allowing independent governments anywhere they marched. In Poland, opposition leaders were detained. In Romania, the monarch was pressured into giving power to communist ministers. In Bulgaria, the political opposition faced harassment. In Hungary, Soviet teams took control of military, police, and intelligence services. Everywhere the pattern was identical. It was systematic. It was calculated. It was spreading. The Soviets didn't hide it. Stalin said privately he wanted countries bordering the USSR to be friendly, or more accurately, under Moscow's influence. He argued that the East had been invaded too many times from the West, and now they needed a buffer. But to Truman, this wasn't about defense, it was about dominance. A buffer zone didn't require controlling half a continent, and a friendly neighbor didn't require silencing every opposing voice. By the end of 1945, Truman saw the truth. Stalin wanted Eastern Europe not as partners, but as satellites, states that would orbit Moscow, controlled politically, economically, and militarily, and he wanted them permanently. But the real breaking point came when Truman received intelligence reports describing the Soviets' behavior in Germany. The German capital had been divided between the victors Berlin was supposed to be jointly administered. Instead, the Soviets behaved as though the eastern half of the city was theirs alone, and they controlled it with an iron grip. Stalin's representatives refused cooperation, withheld food shipments, and pushed their own police forces into the streets. If this was how the Soviets behaved in a shared city, Truman wondered what they would do in countries they held entirely. American diplomats also began reporting something far more alarming. The Soviets were restricting movement of Western officials, monitoring conversations, intercepting cables, and even interrogating local citizens seen speaking to Americans. It was clear, they weren't preparing for partnership. They were preparing for rivalry. Truman wasn't alone in seeing the signs. Winston Churchill, no longer prime minister but still a towering voice in world affairs, visited the United States in 1946 and delivered a speech in Missouri. Truman sat beside him as Churchill told the world what Truman had been uncovering. An iron curtain was descending across Europe. On one side were free nations. On the other were lands under Soviet influence. The phrase stunned the world, but it didn't surprise Truman. By then, he already knew the truth. Churchill simply said it more dramatically. What frightened Truman most wasn't the divide. It was how fast it was happening. Within months, entire governments were being reshaped. Communist parties supported by Soviet advisors grew in influence. Independent newspapers closed. Opposition leaders disappeared. The Soviets didn't need direct rule when they controlled the systems that shaped public life. As Truman studied map after map, the picture grew darker. The Soviets now influenced Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia was sliding half of Europe. Right in front of him, was changing overnight. That's when Truman asked a critical question. What happens if the Soviets don't stop at Eastern Europe? What if, like the conflict they just fought, their ambitions expand? America had never planned to stay in Europe long. After the First World War, the United States retreated. After the Second, many expected the same. But Truman realized that if the Soviets filled the vacuum again, Europe would be permanently divided, and the consequences would shape the century. So he made a decision that broke with American tradition. The US would stay in Europe, not as occupiers, but as protectors. Instead of withdrawing, they would rebuild. Instead of isolating, they would invest. And instead of assuming peace, they would prepare for tension. The Truman Doctrine was born from these observations. It wasn't just a policy, it was a warning. If independent nations were pressured, America would support them. If Europe needed rebuilding, America would fund it. If the Soviets pushed outward, they would meet resistance. But the world didn't change instantly. The Soviets had their own interpretation of Truman's moves. They saw American aid as influence. They saw cooperation as competition. They believed the United States wanted global dominance just as much as they did. And so, a rivalry began, not with gunfire, but with suspicion. Truman realized that the fate of Europe was no longer about borders. It was about ideology, pressure, and influence. Two visions of the world, meeting in the ruins of the old one. The final confirmation came in 1948, during the crisis that shook Truman's inner circle. The Soviets sealed off every road, rail line, and canal leading into West Berlin, trying to force the West out of the city. They expected Truman to retreat. Instead, America launched the Berlin Airlift, flying supplies non-stop into the city. Day after day, planes filled the sky. Truman understood the stakes. If the Soviets controlled Berlin, they could control everything east of the Elbe. By the time the crisis ended, Truman no longer had any doubts. The Soviets didn't just want influence, they wanted a sphere so large it reached the center of Europe, and they were willing to use pressure and power to get it. Looking back, Truman's realization wasn't a single moment. It was a series of discoveries, warnings, confrontations, and crises. Each one peeled back another layer of Stalin's plans. Each one revealed a little more of the truth America hadn't been prepared to see. The day Truman realized the Soviets wanted half of Europe wasn't marked on a calendar. There was no announcement, no headline. It was the day he finally accepted what the evidence had been telling him for months. Stalin didn't just want security, he wanted domination. And if America didn't answer, the map of the world would be redrawn by force, the kind that leaves nations changed forever. And from that moment, Truman's mission changed. The conflict that shaped the next 40 years didn't begin with a shot. It began with a realization. The war was ending, but the struggle for Europe's future had just begun.